Presentation slides. Oil shock of 1973-74. Slide 1. Title slide. Slide content. Oil shock of 1973-1974. Energy crisis and global power shift. Macroeconomic transformation and geopolitics as well as inflation. The oil shock of 1973-1974 represents one of the most significant turning events in modern economic history. It demonstrates that control over energy resources could reshape global power structure and economic stability. During this period, oil-producing nations exercised strategic leverage by restricting supply, causing a dramatic increase in oil prices. This event not only disrupted global markets but also triggered inflation, slowed economic growth, and forced governments to rethink that correction to force governments to rethink their energy strategies. The crisis revealed that industrial economies were deeply dependent on imported oil, making energy security a central pillar of national strategy. Slide 2. Background of the global economy before 1973. Slide content. Post World War II economic expansion, heavy reliance on cheap oil, growth of industrial economies, Bretton Woods system is weakening, and rising inflation prices. Before the oil shock, the global economy experienced a strong economic growth fueled by industrial expansion and abundant access to inexpensive energy. Oil played a central role in transportation, manufacturing, electricity production, and agriculture. Many countries built economic systems based on assumption that energy would remain cheap and abundant indefinitely. At the same time, the Bretton Woods monetary system began to weaken, leading to currency instability and rising inflation pressures. These structural vulnerabilities made the global economy more sensitive to sudden supply disruptions in critical resources such as oil. Slide 3. Formation and role of OPEC. Slide content. OPEC formed in 1960. Major oil producing countries joined, coordinated production decisions, increased control over global oil supply, strategic influence over pricing. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries such as OPEC was created in 1960 to coordinate petroleum policies among major oil producing nations. These countries sought to increase their bargaining power against multinational oil corporations and importing nations. By controlling a significant proportion of global oil production, OPEC gradually gained the ability to influence prices through coordinated supply adjustments. As demand for oil increased in industrial economies, OPEC's strategic importance grew, giving member states increasing economic and political leverage in global affairs. Slide 4. The Yom Kippur War as immediate trigger. Slide content. War between Israel and Arab states. US supported Israel. Arab oil producers responded strategically. Oil used as geopolitical leverage. Beginning of embargo. The immediate cause of the oil shock was the Yom Kippur War of October 1973, a conflict between Israel and a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria. When United States provided military and financial support to Israel, Arab oil producing nations responded by imposing an oil embargo on countries perceived as supporting Israel. This decision transformed oil into a strategic political weapon. Rather than engaging directly in military confrontation, oil producing nations used their control over energy supply to impose economic costs on their geopolitical rivals. Slide 5. Oil embargo and production cuts. Slide content. Oil exports restricted to targeted countries. Production cuts gained global supply. Supply shock created scarcity. Oil price rose rapidly. Global markets destabilized. Following the embargo announcement, participating oil countries reduced oil production and restricted exports to targeted nations. The reduction in supply created immediate shortages in global markets because modern economies rely heavily on petroleum. The sudden decrease in supply caused a rapid increase in prices. Oil prices rose from approximately $2.9 per barrel before the crisis to over $11 per barrel within a few months. This dramatic increase triggered widespread economic disruption across industrial economies. Slide 6. Impact on oil prices. Slide content. Oil prices quadrupled, rapid increase within months, increased production costs, energy expenses surged, inflation accelerated. The rapid increase in oil prices represented one of the most dramatic commodity price shocks in modern history. Because oil is a key input in nearly all economic production process, high energy costs translated into higher transportation costs, manufacturing costs, and consumer prices. Business pass these costs on consumers, contributing to rising inflation. The sudden price increase exposed the vulnerability of economies heavily dependent on imported energy resources. Slide 7. Inflation and cost push dynamics. Slide content. Oil is a key production input. Higher energy costs increased production costs. Prices increased across industries. Cost push inflation occurred, reduced pricing power. Oil affects nearly every sector of the economy, including transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, and electricity production. When oil prices increase dramatically, farms experience higher operating costs. To maintain profitability, business increased prices for goods and services. This created cost push inflation, where rising input costs drive general price increases throughout the economy. Consumers experience reduced purchasing power, meaning that the same amount of money could buy fewer goods and services. Slide 8. Economic consequences and stagflation. Slide content. Higher inflation, lower economic growth, rising unemployment, breakdown of traditional economic models, policy challenges increased. One of the most important outcomes of the oil shock was stagflation, a condition where inflation rises while economic growth slows. Traditionally, economists believed that inflation and unemployment had an inverse relationship. However, during the 1970s, both inflation and unemployment increased simultaneously. This contradicted existing economic theories and forced policymakers to reconsider how macroeconomic policy should respond to supply shocks. Central bank policy dilemma. Slide content. Raise interest rates to control inflation, lower interest rates to stimulate growth, cannot fully solve both problems simultaneously. Policy trade-off between policy trade-offs become unavoidable. Monetary theory evolved. Central banks faced a difficult decision during the oil crisis. Raising interest rates could reduce inflation but risked slowing economic growth and increasing unemployment. Lower interest rates could stimulate growth but risked increasing inflation further. Policymakers had to balance these competing objectives, leading to important developments in macroeconomic theory regarding expectations and inflation control. Slide 10. Impact on global power balance. Slide content. Oil producers gained financial power, increased geopolitical influence, resource control became a strategic advantage, economic dependency became visible, shift in global power perception. The oil shock demonstrated that countries controlling strategic resources could exercise influence over global economic conditions. Oil exporting nations accumulated significant financial wealth due to higher prices. This wealth increased their influence in international financial markets and policy negotiations. The crisis highlighted the importance of resource control as a source of geopolitical power. Slide 11. Energy security policy changes. Slide content. Strategic petroleum reserves created, diversification of energy sources, investment in nuclear energy, research in renewable energy, efficiency improvements encouraged. Governments responded to the crisis by implementing policies to reduce dependence on imported oil. Strategic petroleum reserves were created to store emergency energy supplies. Countries investing in nuclear energy, renewable energy technologies, and energy efficiency improvements. These changes were designed to reduce vulnerability to future supply disruptions. Slide 12. Long-term economic effects. Slide content. Persistent inflation during 1970s, slower economic growth, changes in monetary policy framework, increased focus on energy diversification, created awareness of global supply risk. The effects of the oil shock extended far beyond the immediate crisis period. Inflation remained high throughout much of the 1970s, influencing monetary policy decisions for decades. Governments and firms became more aware of supply chain risks and geopolitical vulnerabilities. The crisis contributed to structural changes in how economies manage energy supply and inflation risk. Slide 13. Conclusion. Oil became a geopolitical weapon. Energy dependency created vulnerability. Supply shocks influenced inflation. Policy frameworks evolved. And energy security became strategic priority. The oil shock of 1973-1974 demonstrated that economic stability depends not only on production and consumers, correction, and consumption, but Also, on control over critical resources. The crisis transformed energy into a strategic instrument of political influence. It revealed structural weaknesses in global economic systems and forced governments to adopt new strategies for managing risk, inflation, and resource dependence. The lesson from this crisis continue to shape global economic policy even today.